Hi everyone, Joe March here with the Grand Infinity, and today we're going to talk about being sovereign. If you've been in the occult community as long as I have, you've heard the term sovereign used a lot. It's often used in how we're supposed to handle ourselves or carry ourselves while in practice, and it's also often used to describe how you're supposed to behave around entities. But a lot of people have trouble with the concept of being sovereign or sovereignty and understanding exactly what that means. So I've got an example that I think will help people to understand what I mean when I say you should be sovereign when you work with entities. Now before we get into talking about that, let's just specify that if you believe that entities are psychological aspects of the self, this still applies. If you believe that they are spirits that you're calling forth or that you're going to see, this still applies. If you believe they're forces manifesting as entities using masks, this still applies. No matter what view of working with entities, spirits, etc. you fall into, this still applies to how you should behave. And any one of those schools will see why as I explain this. Another word for sovereign is king, or queen, or emperor, or empress. Whichever you prefer is fine. I like to use the word king because it resonates best with me. We are each kings over our own reality, and I don't mean the reality of the physical world around us. I mean over our experiences, over our mind, over our body, and over our soul. So the way we experience the world is up to our perspective, and the person who decides what our perspective is us, the commingling of the conscious and subconscious mind. And one who is control of that commingling, who can decide how they see the world, is the king of that reality, that experience. The way you think, the thoughts in your head, those are all under the control of this same thing, which is you, the king, if you accept that responsibility. And so to be sovereign is to accept responsibility for what happens to you, for how you view the world, for how you interact with others, for everything about you. Your physical well-being, your mental well-being, your spiritual well-being, all of those things. You are king. Not to mean that you can do whatever you want. That's not how kings work. You're someone who is in control of that. In other words, you take responsibility for deciding what you eat. You take responsibility to deciding how you exercise. You take responsibility for the thoughts that you have, whether they're positive, negative, or elsewise. You take responsibility for your views on the world. You take responsibility for the decisions on all of those things, as a king of a country would have the responsibility for such decisions about his country. To take it a step further, when dealing with entities, you are like a king of your reality who's going to meet with a king of another reality. So when we treat entities with respect, it should be a mutual respect, as if we are a king traveling to their country, as if we are going to another culture space, respecting that culture, respecting their king, but at the same time we're not kowtowing, we're not bowing down to their king, because our country, our reality, is of equal value to theirs. That's why you would go to make an alliance in the first place, to show we are strong, you are strong, and we want to come together. That's how most alliances are made. And in fact, this is how you should behave around other people that are your friends as well. If your friends feel like equals to you, then you are behaving as a king would behave around other kings. If your friends feel inferior to you, then either you are hanging out with weaker kingdoms, which is not a good idea, or you are inflating your ego, you are in a belief that you are greater than you are, which leads to disaster as well. If your friends always seem to be above you and belittling you, then you are not with equal kings. You are in a tyranny where your country is being held hostage by these other countries. That's also not your friends. Your friends should be equal kings, and that's how everything should be. The same thing with these entities. You should treat them as equals, but it isn't just like treat people how you would want to be treated. Give them the proper respect that you would give a king in charge of their own reality, because each of us are exactly that. That's what it means to be sovereign. It's how you should treat everything in your life if you're able to get into that mindset. Understand that you are in control of you, and that's how it should be. And don't let others be in control of you. Now, you can work for someone else with a mutual respect, but that's different than having them control you. And it's important to make that distinction, because a lot of people will jump to that conclusion. They'll say, well, since I work for someone else and he's my boss, I'm a slave. Like, that's not true. If you're a king working with another king on a project, and that king has been given a title above yours for the duration of that project, that does not make you a lesser king than him. That just puts him in charge of this particular project, and you have still agreed to an alliance to work on this project. None of that is slavery. That is an open relationship. It's important to understand that difference because a lot of conspiracy theories now would make us believe that we're all under some form of slave labor. The only way that you're actually like a slave in this reality is if you allow yourself to be controlled like a slave. This is when you give up your kingship, when you decide, instead of making alliances based on what works for you, to let other people make decisions for you. When other people make your decisions for you, and they aren't necessarily decisions you agree with, but you choose not to speak up, you are choosing to allow them to make you a slave, as opposed to exerting your right as king to speak your mind. And so this is where that difference comes in. This is where the difference between being sovereign and being a slave, things like that happen. It isn't usually something forced upon you. You aren't forced to become king. You aren't forced to become slave. You decide which of these things you want to be in your life. Now, there are physical things that we can't undo. Again, we're not talking about manipulation of the physical world. We're talking about your internal world, which before you can do any of these powers on the physical world, you need to control your internal world. So it's highly important that you understand that you can't just jump from one to the other. You need to master the self before moving on. And you do this through sovereignty. So hopefully this has explained it. But if there's questions still, please leave them in the comments section below. And until next time, safe travels.